I look at storytelling as a way to engage hearts and minds, but also to communicate ideas that tend to travel because people remember stories.
5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
40 seconds, Pip. We're going.
Never in the field of human conflict.
How do you measure such an astonishing moment in history?
You're listening to the bigQUEST podcast with Andy Murray. In a high-stakes, unpredictable world, every day is ripe with blue ocean adventures just waiting to be discovered. You need the mindset, the methods, and the motivation to lead with confidence into the unknown. Come along as we talk to today's top leaders, known for simplifying challenges, outsmarting variables, and inspiring greatness. So welcome to the bigQUEST podcast. In this season, we're focused on the 5 questions that every great leader wrestles with while launching a big quest. Blue ocean initiatives, game-changing adventures. So let's bring in our host. Here he is, Andy Murray. And,
hey there, Ben. How are you today?
Good. I feel a little underdressed. You're rocking the blazer. You look very distinguished. Got that.
Well, you got to at least look smart in case I don't say something that sounds that smart.
Well, you don't have the Sean Connery accent, but just about everything else is going on there.
And I don't play tennis.
Yeah, exactly. The other Andy Murray. All right, we're going through these 5 questions, but can we just back up for a second and talk about who is the bigQUEST for? Who is this content for, the bigQUEST framework? We're going to go through these 5 questions, but when do these come up for people?
Well, they come up most frequently when you're trying to do a new initiative where you can't really just work through the incrementality and optimize something that currently exists. And so the type of initiatives I'm after from a help standpoint really come from a place where you can't rely on past patterns and past experiences. So you're going to have to use a bit more right brain type thinking, and we'll get into that. But it takes a different approach to go after those types of initiatives where you're needing to go in and come up with a new value proposition you haven't done before, or bring something new that the organization perhaps hasn't seen before or do before. And those have a very different set of challenges to them. And yet in today's environment, we're seeing more and more of a need for leaders that are skilled in their ability to do that.
All right. So I'm looking at, on the bigQUEST website, you list these different scenarios where somebody might need this type of thing. And you've got senior corporate leaders who are trying to lead a breakthrough. Yeah. You talk about senior account leaders who are trying to build that sort of top-to-top alignment. Product owners and managers that are leading these sort of agile adventures, if you will. Nonprofit leaders, entrepreneurs who are maybe launching a new offering, professionals wanting to sort of upskill their leadership toolbox, if you will. And those are all great. And what I'm understanding from that is that we're really talking about scenarios where somebody, it's a little different from the other every day, isn't it?
Yeah, and in those particular examples of roles that people might be in, they do share some common elements. And I've had the opportunity, for example, to work on a top-to-top client-supplier relationship when I was at P&G working on the Walmart team. And there were some unique things that happened there that Tom Muccio, which we'll hear from through our podcast series, took a different approach on building a really strong, powerful quest, if you will, on taking that relationship to the next level. And those principles really work. They really do work. And they became a game-changing model for the industry. For many, many suppliers follow that model that Tom and the team pioneered. But the elements of that, of being able to define a problem and go through these 5 things I'm talking about, are very applicable to any type of big client and supplier relationship where you want to get more, and you can think of a way to partner together so that 1 + 1 = 3. And often both companies are faced with different problems, and to come up with a shared problem, a shared idea of the outcome you want is usually pretty unique, because a lot of times a supplier will come with their sales list. Here's what they want to sell, and the retailer or client will have their list of what they want to get, and it isn't really a joint vision to go create something bigger. And so that's just one example. And I hear that all the time working with different suppliers in my last role, where they actually wanted to do more. They wanted to do bigger things and move from a transactional, let's just improve the relationship. And certainly there's a lot of work to be done to do that and incrementally do that. But then how do you go about trying to do something you both haven't done together ever before?
Right.
There are some steps that you could work through to make that happen.
Well, when we start talking about these 5 questions in just a minute, one of the things that I notice is that it starts to sound, at least there's a part of my brain that goes off and says, yeah, but isn't this just strategic planning? Isn't this just, begin with the end in mind kind of stuff? And I can tell it's a little different, but how do you defend that when that thought comes up?
Well, typical strategic planning has a bit longer time horizon to it, and most strategic planning has a framework to it, where you look at a 3-year outcome that you're trying to get to, and an objective, and that objective is typically what you both want to achieve, and then you start building a 3-year detailed plan behind that, and that's usually ends up being a financial plan. And I've said before, I think sometimes those 3-year plans are built to make astrology look credible, uh, because down deep that that's not really based on something that inspires and motivates. And most strategic plans don't consider one key element, and that is, how do you engage the hearts and minds of an entire organization that needs to get behind that and make it really happen? And today, very few strategic plans are going to spit out an outcome that says the top down can make it all happen by themselves. Usually the types of problems we're in today, they have to be, you have to unlock a whole bunch of ideas across an organization that are all on the front lines, and get that energy moving in the right direction to come up with loads of ideas than what necessarily a strategic planning process typically leaves out.
Right. And one of the things that you talk about early in the process here is, just the need to sort of pause and think about, gosh, why would I be spending all this time to identify the problem, to clarify the problem? And I'll just, as we get into this, the first question, you're really talking about the difference between right brain and left brain thinking, and how, the human brain is kind of wired to analyze problems efficiently, but not always effectively. So if you're a left brain person, this is really an invitation to sort of view things differently. And it seems like, as you pointed out, most leaders are sort of left brain thinkers. Why do you think that is?
Well, I think it's for a very good reason. A very good reason, and that is we want to be successful, and with an achievement-based mindset, which is different than maybe wanting to do something original. But if you're trying to achieve results, the smart and wise move would be to pull from things that you might have done before in the past that work. You want to pull from your memory banks of repeatable patterns and things that you can spot quickly, and you got to move at pace. And so a person that wants to achieve quite a bit in their career will typically focus on the things that don't invite in more risk or don't invite in more uncertainty. That's the last thing you want to have added to your set of challenges, is to do that. And so we've rewarded it. Actually, most corporations are set up to have a bit of a bias against creativity and original ideas, because you want to go after what's certain and what works. And so that desire to achieve is often more powerful than the desire to do something original.
And the downfall of that is, as you pointed, I've heard you point this out too, is that meanwhile customers are making decisions not so much on a rational basis, but on a part it's not necessarily emotional, but it includes a lot. And I think one of the things I've heard you talk about is the way that this whole process, the bigQUEST framework, is really a leadership strategy or framework that allows you to include that sort of right brain component as well.
Yeah, it is. I mean, I think that's certainly, you can't do this with a kind of a left brain planning mindset, because you have to address things that take you to some unknown spaces and let your preconceived notions be set aside on what's going to work or not work, and that starts to activate the right brain. And I think when you look at what's happening, yes, there's some really clear big strategic objectives, and strategic planning process will kick those out, and I think that's still necessary. This isn't meant to replace strategic planning, but once that senior leadership team or that entrepreneur, defines those big things they have to go after, we do have new processes at the bottom, which is called Agile, which is getting rolled out, and it's obviously on trend and on fire right now. Agile is getting rolled out everywhere, which kind of came from the pure play place, but it has the core elements, the essential elements to put new ideas into play, with the test and learn, a scientific model to go explore new ideas, hold back your assumptions on what's going to work. So the bottom elements are there, and the top objective there. It's the gap in between the top and the bottom that doesn't really give leaders, mid-level leaders, senior leaders, the tools to be able to connect those two worlds.
Yeah.
And so that's what the piece that you've got to have that I feel has been quite missing.
One industry that has done this famously is the advertising industry, and both you and I both have some background in the advertising world. And I think I've heard the story that Bill Bernbach was the first guy that said, "Hey, why are the art directors and copywriters on different floors, and why are the account executives?" And really, it's you got to look at the advertising industry as a great example of an industry that has not separated or gone completely left brain or right brain, but they're constantly sort of managing the tension that exists between them. And really what you're describing is, yes, strategic planning is important, and but let's not check our brains at the door.
Yeah.
Let's keep being creative as we work within the confines that we've agreed to. So never surrendering that creative process.
Yeah. Well, and I think, as you and I both know, working in the advertising industry, you really are challenged to come up with new blue ocean type ideas on a regular basis. And so you get a bit more wired with that in mind. And then you're working with organizations that tend to be more process related. So you have to relate to the kind of a left brain model. And so you live in that tension quite a bit inside the agency and between the client and the agency environment. And so why bigQUEST was so compelling for me is that I've spent the last 6 years in a big corporate environments, and the first 10 years in big corporate environments. And I believe that the principles you learn inside an agency of how to make that creative idea ecosystem work is also now in demand in corporate culture, corporate America.
Yeah.
Because you can't, there's a demand for that creativity and that ability to come up with ideas that will actually work and scale. It's easy to come up with a bunch of ideas, and that's the one thing that is maybe a little different than a creative agency, is that inside an organization, you do need to calibrate it with, is that idea a great idea that will also scale? Yeah. And I've seen loads of great ideas presented by very creative agencies, but a number of them wouldn't get past, a rollout of a couple of stores before it would start to implode under its own weight. And so creating ideas that actually scale is a big part of what I'm talking about.
Yeah. And also the fact that, you can't just give over to right brain thinking and creativity. And I think that's exactly right. That's one of the things that, causes people to sort of maybe reel a little bit at the idea of right brain leadership, is that no, we need structure, and they know that. And the great thing about the bigQUEST framework that I've seen is that it's really, in a way, it creates these sort of agreements of context in which great creativity is encouraged, still honoring the structure that has been agreed upon. And that sort of brings us to our first question of the 5 questions. Take us into that. Tell us what that question is and what it means and why it's so important.
Well, the first question is really about defining the single biggest problem that you're trying to solve. And that is such a focusing question to make sure that you're not just starting with a solution or here's a great idea. And you can't believe how many times I've been looking at a new idea that's come in, and you start to work through, well, what is the problem that you're really trying to solve? And it hasn't been very clear. It hasn't worked. It was just a shiny new object or a new technology. And with technology changing so quickly, it's easy to get excited about a solution, but then not really clear what's the use case on how that solution actually is going to solve a problem that's really important to the customer. And so for me, I think the problem to be solved is not my problem, but it's what problem do we need to go out and solve that's the single biggest, most important problem to the customer, and being really clear that that's the kind of problem that we're after, then just balancing it by here's a bunch of ideas that we should maybe go build a quest and go do something with. So it's super important, and you'd be surprised how often people start off on a journey with a solution in mind or an idea in mind, and they haven't thought about, well, are we really solving a problem that matters to the customer, and how so?
I remember back in my agency days, the Young and Rubicam creative work plan would come around, and it would have all the and one of the great disciplines that we did was figuring out how to populate that, answer all the questions and everything. The one that was the trickiest on there was the problem statement, and I remember specifically that there were so many different ways to write the problem. You could write it as the customer's problem. You could write it as the client or advertiser's problem. You could write it in a number of different levels. What's a good way? How do I validate that I've got the right problem statement here if I'm working through this?
Well, I think it has to start with, how does the problem affect your customer's life? And that is, it should be really clear what the impact of that problem is on their life. Now, when I say customer, I am generally talking about customers of your company, but it also can be a key stakeholder. So this works as well if you're leading in a finance department and your key stakeholder is the marketing organization or the sales force. They are a key customer for you. So if you're going to start out on something, then you're asking, how does this problem affect their life, and go at it from that standpoint. And one way you know that you're onto it is when you play back that problem to the customer and they respond back with, that's right, that's exactly what I'm talking about. And you get this emotional response, a visceral response that says, you know exactly what I'm talking about. When you articulate that problem back, that's exactly what I'm feeling. And that comes from being great at empathy. And we talk about mindsets, the mindset of being able to be very empathetic as a leader to make sure you can get to that space where the customer is giving you that visceral response back.
Well, all of those things are, triggers or symbols of the right brain thinking. You know that you're thinking, including the right brain, not completely right brain thinking, but you've included the right brain component when somebody responds viscerally and when you are incorporating empathy into the equation. So,
100%. Yeah. And you know what, you get into why this is so hard sometimes and different is, like you said, we look for these patterns and we want to play the pattern that we've seen before because our brains are trying to spend our brains are mentally lazy, right? We want to spend the least energy we have to on solving that. So we look for that. And it reminds me of what I heard once around how big 52 factor is. And let me explain. If you take a deck of cards, this is hard to get your head around, but if you take a deck of cards and you randomly shuffle it 3 or 4 times, the idea that you're holding a deck that someone else has held before in that same order is 52 factored, which is 6 quintillion. 6 quintillion. That's the odds that you're holding a deck of cards that had ever been shuffled before or will again. And to get your head around 6 quintillion, you would have to go around the globe and place a dollar bill to cover the earth, the whole surface of the earth. And you do that until you reach the height of Mount Everest, and then you turn around and do it again. And now you're starting to make a dent into how big 6 quintillion is, just to give you a look at that. But if you actually take that deck of cards and look at it, there's 52 variables there that you're dealing with, that the same 52 variables been there forever. Four different suits and 13 cards. Those variables are consistent. So if you didn't know that in terms of how the data really works, the way that math works exponentially, it's very easy to say, oh, I've seen that deck before. I've played that hand before. I know. Well, probably not. The variables are always dynamic and changing every single day. And so that's the fallacy of trying to reach in and pull these set patterns, is the variables we live with every single day are so different and dynamic, especially in the uncertain space we're in today, that it's very difficult to find a pattern that you could just pull out and execute quickly, even though the variables feel familiar.
Yeah.
They feel familiar, but the patterns and how they go don't operate that way. I mean, I'm just reading a book that I found fantastic. It's come out by Maria Konnicka, and it's called The Biggest Bluff. And she is a psychologist that decided to try to get in the World Series of Poker within a year. So she got with Eric Seidman, who is the won World Series of Poker several times. He's got several bracelets to coach her on how to do that. And the thing about poker that's so interesting is you've got a pretty straightforward game to play, but there is uncertainty because you've got luck. And then you also have skill, and you have to put luck and skill, uncertainty and skill together to learn how to play that game and play it well. And so she asked him in the book, what's the most important advice that you can have, that you can give to be a champion at this game? And he came back with 2 words: pay attention. Pay attention. And it's about the power of observation. It's a very right brain game to win, even though it might feel like it lives in a high math, high analysis type space. And a lot of those guys are high math, high analytics and algorithms to calculate best odds of playing any single hand a certain way. Yeah, they do win well, but he wins by paying attention. And that is a very right brain thing, to be able to observe and understand. And when you start looking at a problem with a blank sheet of paper and you don't take in preconceived notions, you might find that the solutions and the outcomes you want are exponentially better than what you went in with. And it almost always happens that way. And that's why I say start with a problem, although our nature is to start with, hey, I've got 3 ideas, or I know the answer to that very quickly, and then you just jump to it.
Yeah, and kind of what you're pointing to here is the fact that, and the reason that this type of leadership, this right brain leadership and this bigQUEST approach to things is so important today, is because the variables that come up,
That's right.
The 6 quintillion variables that we face every day, even though we've already made a strategic plan decision, there's still so many things that come up that you have to pay attention, as you're saying.
Yes.
That would be a great recommendation for anybody. My only recommendation would be is if you had enough money to travel the earth and stack up to Mount Everest, don't play cards. Stay away from that little card game. The bigQUEST podcast with Andy Murray will return right after this break.
Today, more than ever, we need leaders who lead with the values of excellence, professionalism, innovation, and collegiality, which stand for EPIC. These are the values the Walton College of Business consistently demonstrate. I've worked with the Walton College as a business owner or executive for over 25 years, and I can tell you with certainty, the students we've hired, the exec ed programs, and the insights from their research have made an epic impact and continue to inspire me with new ways of thinking. Their vision to bring thought leadership to the challenges business face today, such as business integrity or how to be a customer-centric organization, that adds real value by creating conversations that connect people with organizations, faculty, industry, and practice. I put a link in the show notes to Dean Matt Waller's Be Epic podcast, where you'll hear stories and get great content that will inspire you to be epic.
We now return to the bigQUEST podcast with Andy Murray. Storytelling is also something that you talk about a lot, and the ability to not only ask a question, but to incorporate storytelling into the equation. How does storytelling fit in if I'm trying to answer the first question?
Well, I look at storytelling as a way to engage hearts and minds, but also to communicate ideas that tend to travel because people remember stories. And there's two parts of storytelling I think it's important. Every great story arc that's ever been written, actually the protagonist encounters a problem. And that's where books start. That's where movies start, is when the protagonist encounters the problem. And so that's the starting point of any great story. And it has to be the starting point of a quest, is when what you're trying to get done as a protagonist really gets clear about the problem. Another way that storytelling helps quite a bit, and why I'm a big fan of using storytelling, is there's nothing more powerful than when you've identified that problem, you've sat down with a customer and you get them to explain how that problem affects their life in their story. And so many things I've had experience to do over my career has been helped and amplified when I can take a customer story and put real context and real life and real truth from a customer's point of view into that way of talking about the problem.
Yeah.
So those are two different elements where storytelling is really important.
All right. So let's for the people listening, let's give some examples of what it looks like to write a problem statement, a correct problem statement. Is the storytelling element in the problem statement, or is that something that I do to communicate the storytelling, or to communicate the problem statement to people once I've figured it out?
It's both and. And so what we've done with these 5 key questions is put them in a way that you can create a mini story about what it is you're trying to do.
So collectively, it tells a story.
Collectively, it tells a story, and it lets you connect the threads so that you don't lose the plot.
Yeah.
You don't want to lose the plot between what you're trying to solve and the outcome that you get and how you're going to measure. Those things have to stay connected, and you want them connected. And it also lets you find out where you got big holes in your story. If you're trying to sort out and go for something important, but then you leave out how you're going to measure progress, you've got a major hole in your story that's going to become a problem down the road. And so we've tried to write these questions in a way that makes it clear that how they hang together, and then second, it makes it clear where you've got a hole in your plot line. Yeah. So when I start looking at writing the problem itself, what problem we're trying to solve, then I look at it to make sure that I don't put the solution into that, because that's really easy to do. But let me give you an example. Let's say that hypothetically, and I talk about this in the worksheet checklist, but let's say you're a company and you've got a call center that may not be performing as well as you'd like, in terms of customers are not really getting a consistent experience from that. And you've got a sales floor, and you probably or may have a brand purpose, you should have, that talks about how important customers really are. But when customers interact with the call center, they may not get that great experience because of a variety of reasons, right? And so one easy thing to do is you saying, well, you know what, we need to reshore that. Maybe the call center's been offshored. Let's reshore that. And that's the answer. Let's just jump in and start solving it, or let's put in new metrics or whatever. And it's like, no. What is the problem you're trying to solve? And if it really is inconsistency, then you need to be really clear. Look, here's the problem we're trying to solve. We're creating an inconsistent brand experience with our call center as compared to other aspects of interacting with customers, and that is creating mistrust with our customers. Okay, so now you've got the mistrust, you know the emotion, you know what they're feeling, and you've got the real clarity that this is what we're trying to fix, this inconsistency that's creating mistrust.
Yeah. All right. So any other examples you can give us? Let's say that I'm internally working to try to sell an idea upstream in the company. How do I look at the problem statement there in that context? Do I look at it from the problem I'm trying to solve departmentally, or do I think about the problem that my superior is trying to solve? Can we put that in the context of of some specifics?
Well, you're trying to solve a problem that matters, again, to the customer and is tied to your brand purpose. Okay,
So
so
the
if you've
customer
got
being my superior at this point.
um the question's going to be, is that problem worth solving? If it's just a problem, that you're trying to solve, that you have.
They have to be trying to solve it on the behalf of the customer and the
Right.
brand as well. Got
Right.
it.
Yeah.
Okay.
I'm talking about, if it's a simple problem that is like, we need to reduce cost. Okay.
Right.
Well, that's not, you're really then talking about areas that there's a lot of data versus where there's not. And so the first thing I'd look at, Ben, is to say there are two types of problems.
Mm-hmm.
There are complicated problems and there are complex problems.
Okay.
Right. And so a complicated problem is the data is there. It's just a lot of it maybe to sort through, but it's complicated on how to put it together. That I would call a puzzle.
Yeah.
And you got to solve a puzzle. It takes work, but there's a way to go about that that's pretty straightforward, right? You find the edges, the corners first, then you start putting the pieces in. It takes time, and a lot of projects that we talk about and problems to solve are just complicated problems that you've got to work through, but you have the data. The complex problem is you don't have the data. That's the key thing. You don't know, and so I call that a mystery.
Mm-hmm.
And you solve a mystery very differently than you solve a puzzle. And so
that's
you've
where
got
the bigQUEST framework comes in.
Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly. It helps you go into to solve that as a mystery. And maybe one of the best ways to explain that, I don't know, Ben, if you've ever gone through any of those escape rooms. It's really popular right now. If you take your family through an escape room.
I'm afraid to go. I'm not.
I was too, by the way, but I've been to a couple, and it's quite an experience to take with your family. Depending on what kind of personality types you have amongst your tribe,
Right.
or go with some friends, because it can really degrade into some challenging conversations. But you're really trying to go through it, and you get in there, you realize that there's like no instruction. You just got to get through this room, and how to get out of the room into the next room. You do have a lot of, you don't have a lot of clues. You get a few clues,
Mm-hmm.
but what you're looking for there is what's not there. What's not familiar, what seems out of place. You're looking for the unfamiliar things to make connections and say, I think that might go over here with that. And that takes, as Erica Simon says, that you have to really pay attention. You have to really pay attention. And there's nothing that's going to be in your memory bank that's going to help you pull that forward to say, I've solved this one before, because they're really difficult problems to solve. But they take imagination, and they take the ability to absorb new things and powers of observation to get through it. That's what you have to do when you're solving a mystery that's very different than solving a puzzle. Okay,
so the first question again, what's the single most important problem that we can solve, right? Mm-hmm. It's not the single biggest necessarily. It's the single most important to our quest that we're going to solve. Any other final advice to give to anybody as they're trying to?
I could probably give one more example, if you don't mind, on how this might be helpful. When you look at a problem we were having with when we launched Olay into Saudi Arabia, we being Procter & Gamble, and I was at Saatchi at the time, and the sales weren't going well because we assumed that we took a global brand proposition that this cured the problem of the 7 signs of aging. And that we thought was the customer problem.
In Saudi Arabia.
In Saudi Arabia.
Okay.
Because that was the global problem. That's what we thought customers wanted. But sales weren't taking off. And so we spent some time on the ground, the planning team from Saatchi, to go in and really understand the customer problem and what was the problem with the brand. And after 2 weeks of being in a home with a family, with a lady and her 3 more adult children, they built a relationship. They started talking, and after a couple of weeks, the Habibs come up, and they saw some things they didn't expect. They saw that there were some intricately painted faces, and it was beautiful, and started to have this conversation. And they said, well, then what do you use oil of Olay for? And they said, well, it creates the most beautiful canvas. And by digging in there, now you're a creative guy, a top creative director. I mean, when you hear a customer say, well, it creates a beautiful canvas, I mean, it's almost the copyright in itself.
I love it when that happens.
Love it when that happens. Exactly. But isn't it a powerful insight if you get that as a creative director to go chomp on to say, this is about creating a beautiful canvas. Man, that's a creative dream because you've got a clarity of what exactly did it mean and feel like in the customer's words.
Yeah.
And so that's what I mean by maybe that's where story comes in a bit, but that's when I get excited about, go spend some time, fall in love with the problem, because when you get into the problem, sometimes the epiphanies that come out when you really interrogate and do the archaeology to get to the root of it, often the answers are right there inside it. Real quick story. Brian Chesky, co-founder of Airbnb, when he was still with Y Combinator with Paul Graham, a company, innovation accelerator, he got some advice to go spend some time with his customers. He didn't have a lot of customers at the beginning. They're all in New York, and he's in California. So he flies out and spends time interviewing host by host the handful of customers he had in Airbnb. And he tells a story about how remarkable it was to hear, when you really go deep into that, of how they use Airbnb to solve the problems, the roadmaps were all inside them of how to take Airbnb to the future, of where they needed to go. And that has become a practice of his, to spend that time really listening and talking. And then all of a sudden the solutions come from the customer themselves.
Okay, great. So basically the lesson that we take from question number one is to slow down and really embrace the problem and think through it from every angle, including these sort of storytelling right brain angles. And the whole benefit of that is that you don't rush past it, that you actually get a chance to discover what the problem is. So I think that's a good place for us to pause here. Yeah. So that'll do it for this episode of the bigQUEST podcast. As always, visit the bigQUEST website, where you can find an ever-growing repository of valuable resources to help you simplify your challenges, outsmart the variables, and can celebrate those victories. Just go to thebigquest.com, and while you're there, be sure to download the free 5 Big Questions checklist to walk your team through the 5 big questions that every successful right brain leader follows when launching a quest. Hey, we at the podcast here are also on a big quest, so please like and subscribe and share this episode with your friends and colleagues. And be sure to join us in the next episode, where we'll explore question number 2. For Andy Murray and the rest of the bigQUEST team, I'm Ben Ortlup saying thanks for listening. Until next time, think big and quest on.